In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the use of concepts and how we measure them in social science studies. So what exactly is a concept? A concept is basically a term that refers to a set of ideas about something that you've observed out there in the social world. A lot of times concepts emerge from social theories. A social theory might specify a relationship between one or more variables. For instance, in when we talked about social theories earlier in the semester, I talked about the stress process model and how that theory allows us or gives us a sense of how exposure to stress impacts health. So, two of the concepts in that social theory, the stress process model, are stress and health. So today we're going to talk about how you define what you mean by a particular concept like stress and how you go about choosing something that indicates somebody's uh, level on that concept, and then how do you go about measuring um, that concept in your own research study through empirical observations. So that's kind of the general gist of what we'll talk about today. So concepts are often derived from theories. However, that's not always the case. It kind of depends on whether you're taking an inductive or a deductive approach. So in a deductive approach, you're starting with a social theory. You're forming a hypothesis, a research question and a hypothesis based on that social theory. And then you might define concepts that are relevant to your research question based on your understanding of that theory and prior research. And that differs from an inductive research approach where you're oftentimes the concepts in an inductive study emerge from the process of observing people and interviewing people during the course of your research. So it's a little different in that in an inductive approach, the concepts emerge during the research process versus in a deductive approach, they're sort of defined up front and usually are based on some sort of social theory. But back to a deductive, when you're taking a deductive approach, you're starting with a social theory, you're forming a research question and a hypothesis. Oftentimes in your literature review, you'll specify what you mean by a particular term or concept up front, usually in the introduction or the background of your paper. And this is really important because concepts, depending on which researcher you might talk to or who you might talk to, or even just in everyday discourse, concepts can have different meanings, and their meanings can change over time. A particular concept, what a particular concept means today, um, might differ from what it meant 10 years ago. And so it's important to sort of define what you mean by a term up front so that also allows you to choose the right set of indicators to represent that concept in your study and to measure it correctly. So you want to sort of choose a definition, and also you want to choose the definition of a concept that best fits your research question or what you're trying to examine. Because concepts can have different definitions, it's really important that you choose the one that's most applicable to your own study. And there might be multiple concepts in your research study. For instance, if you're examining a relationship between an independent and a dependent variable, your independent variable might represent some sort of concept, and your dependent variable might represent some sort of concept. So right away, you have two concepts in your research study. So I'm sort of talking at a high level, and I want to sort of give you an example of what a concept is. One of the concepts that I've used in my own research is the concept of a vulnerable population. The term vulnerable population, this concept comes from the term vulnerability. And vulnerability, the way it's defined in the dictionary, is susceptibility to harm. So, because we're talking about people, there were two researchers, David McCaddock and Jennifer Tanner, and they defined what they meant by a vulnerable population as individuals or groups that have limited resources or resilience to cope with stress and other threats to their health. And this concept has been used in a lot of research studies. Vulnerable groups of people might include older adults, those who have disabilities or physical limitations, the poor, impoverished, certain racial and ethnic minority groups. For example, American Indians might be a group that, because of their history and other social characteristics, they they might be more vulnerable to stress and threats to their health than other racial and ethnic groups. One of this term vulnerable populations, the concept is framed a lot of research, and one of the interesting studies that it was this concept was used in was a study by Eric Kleinenberg, who conducted a qualitative and social autopsy study on the the effect of the Chicago heat wave on people in the city. And in the mid 90s, there was a heat wave in Chicago where the temperature exceeded 100 degrees for several days, and a lot of people died, hundreds of people. And he was interested in, why did some people, why were some people so vulnerable to this disaster, and other people were not? And he found that certain social characteristics increased people's vulnerability to the heat wave and made them more likely to die during the extreme weather event. He found that people who were living alone, who didn't have people watching over them, the very old, that these groups of people were more vulnerable to the heat wave than others who had more social and economic resources. Once you've defined what it is, what the concept is that you're studying and what it represents, the next step in the process is operationalization. And operationalization refers to the process of specifying a set of measures to indicate the value of cases on a variable. And that variable corresponds to your concept. So if you're measuring something like age in your research study, you might want to you might want to define and operationalize age as perhaps the number of years from somebody's date of birth until the present date when you interviewed them. That might be an operational definition of the variable age for your particular study. So operationalization is where you take a concept and you specify a set of measurement operations that will allow somebody who's conducting the study to make a set of observations on somebody and determine their value on that variable. Another example of operationalization is taking the concept of social class and using a particular measure to represent social class. So, one of the common measures of social class that's used in a lot of sociological and economic research is the variable socioeconomic status. And this particular measure has so socioeconomic status is sort of defined as somebody's social and economic position within society. If you think about society as like a several rungs on a ladder, people with higher socioeconomic status have more resources, economic resources that compare to people at the bottom of the ladder who have very few resources. So how do you, and this is used to represent somebody's social class in a research study. And there are usually a set of indicators that researchers use to represent this concept of socioeconomic status. Four of the common indicators that are used to represent SES, as it's known, include income, education, occupation, and wealth. And each of these indicators can be measured or observed using a set of questions that can be asked of people. You can ask people about their household income in the past year, their highest level of educational attainment. Have they completed college or completed high school? Have they obtained a graduate degree? You can ask somebody what their occupation is, or what the occupation that they held for the longest period of time was, and that can give you a sense of, whether somebody's had held a particularly maybe stressful job or a high level position, and that also gets at somebody's socioeconomic status. And finally, wealth. Somebody's family background and their wealth, their level of wealth, stocks, bonds, and property ownership. All of that is also a dimension of social class. So part of the important process of operational operationalization, when you're taking a concept and coming up with measures to capture somebody's value on that conceptual definition, um, you're going to be usually usually in a quantitative or deductive approach type of study. You're going to be coming up with a set of questions that will allow you to measure that concept. And questions allow you to observe somebody's level on a particular variable. And in some cases, you might need several questions to represent a concept. One, it might not be, unlike something like income, you can ask somebody's household income in the past year or educational attainment. You can get at those variables with perhaps single questions. But there are other concepts that are more difficult to ascertain with a single question. And so in this case, you might want to use an index. An index represents a set of several questions which are either summed or averaged to represent somebody's overall level on a particular uh, concept. So in the stress literature, one of the common measures that's used to represent stress is something called the Life Change Index Scale. And this scale asks people about their experience of several life events, including the death of a spouse, divorce or marital separation, being in jail, getting sick, becoming married, becoming pregnant. These, when people respond to these events, whether they experienced them or not, it can give you an idea of how much stress somebody has experienced in the past year. And some of these events are given higher impact scores um, compared to others. So the research has shown that the death of a spouse is one of the most stressful events that somebody can experience. And it's much more stressful than a minor violation of the law, like something like a traffic ticket. And so this scale, these are not all of the events on this scale, but it gives you a flavor or a subset of them to kind of get the idea. But this is a case where you can ask several questions which get at this concept of somebody's level of life stress. Now, interestingly, the process of developing and defining concepts differs depending on whether you're taking an inductive or a deductive approach. So, inductive research, which is often qualitative, you're observing people, you're interviewing them, and in these studies, concepts often emerge during the research process. That is, the concepts come about based on your set of observations or your interviews with the people that you're studying. So let me give you an example of how a concept emerged in a qualitative research study that used an inductive approach. There was a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild, and she wrote a book in 1979 called The Managed Heart. And in this book, she explained her research in which she observed and interviewed several airline stewardesses as they completed a training program for their airline. So they were taught, they received job training on how to behave and how to sort of the responsibilities of being an airline stewardess to help passengers on the airplane. And during her observations of the training seminar, she noticed something really interesting. And she noticed that airline stewardesses were sort of instructed on how to manipulate their bodies to influence the emotions that they convey in different social situations. So you might know, as many of you might have been on an airplane before, that airline stewardesses often encounter unruly passengers, people who maybe have drank too much or are unhappy, maybe with their seat assignment, and they often have to deal with people that are upset or angry, crying babies, and people yelling at each other. And during these situations, they sort of manipulate they try to manipulate their emotions to sort of give off a positive impression and to create to reduce the sort of level of chaos in a situation. You know, they smile at people. They use very measured language and tones with people. And she described this process as she conceptualized this as what she called emotion work. And this is the work that people do to sort of manipulate their emotions in different social situations. So this was an example of a concept that came about in an inductive qualitative research study.